Hello, I'm David Rubenstein, coming to you from the Library of Congress, the Jefferson Building, and it's part of our National Book Festival. And I have the pleasure today of interviewing Richard Haass, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's just written a new excellent book called The World, A Brief Introduction by Richard Haass. So Richard, thank you very much for coming today.
Great to be with you, David.
So Richard, for those who may not know your background, why don't we go through that and then we'll talk a little bit about the book. So you are a native of New York, and you went to college in Ohio, and then you became a Rhodes Scholar. So what did you do to become a Rhodes Scholar? And for those who aren't aware of that, there are only 32 people picked every year in the United States to be Rhodes Scholars. You're theoretically one of the top 32 students that year. So what did you do to be one of the top 32 students the year you graduated from Oberlin?
My children would claim, David, it was an administrative error. I did nothing but get confused with someone who ought to have gotten the Rhodes Scholarship. I could also answer it that I was one of 32 people who simply peaked young and peaked at the right time. My own guess is that I was at Oberlin. I had a rather unconventional background. I just spent a year in the Middle East, traveling around, doing archaeology, studying languages and history. I wrote a column for the campus newspaper. I took all my courses credit, no entry. I was a religion and then a Middle Eastern studies major. I think I probably got it because I had no expectations of getting it. I was as relaxed as anyone could be in the interview, and I simply stood out from the others because I was not a 4.0 student.
Okay, so you went to Oxford, you got a PhD at Oxford, you came back, and I think you then taught at Harvard for a while.
Ultimately, I've had what you might call a classic in and outer career. I worked on the Hill, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House, and so forth. And then in between, I've been either teaching at universities or at think tanks. It's the kind of career you really can only have in the United States. Every other country pretty much forces you to choose a path. And one of the many great things about this country is you never really have to decide what you want to do when you grow up.
So you had two very important positions in the government that I'm aware of. One is during the Bush 41 administration, you were in charge of the Middle East, among other things, of the National Security Council staff. And then later in the Bush 43 administration, under Colin Powell as Secretary of State, you were an undersecretary of state then, and an ambassador as well. Is that right?
I was in charge of the policy planning staff at state. Plus, I had this separate hat where I was a roving ambassador and did such things as I was the U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. After 9/11, I was put in charge of putting together the future of Afghanistan.
Well, that's a lot to do. And after all of that was done, you then became the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an organization that I'm obviously familiar with as well. But can you tell us what you do at the Council on Foreign Relations? What is the Council on Foreign Relations for people who are not members?
Council's about 100 years old. We're going to actually celebrate our 100th in 2021. We're a hybrid organization. We're a national membership organization. We have about 5,000 members. We're a research organization. We've got, 75, 80 full and part-time scholars, essentially a think tank. We're a publisher. We publish Foreign Affairs Magazine, the leading journal in the field. We also have several websites, including CFR.org. And we're really an organization that I would say there's two other things that are important. One is we try to cultivate talent, essentially grow the next generation of foreign policy experts in the United States. All sorts of ways we try to encourage and nurture that. And then we're increasingly an educator. We're putting out an entire curriculum, World 101, but we do all sorts of educational activities, not just for members, but for people who need to be in the foreign policy debate, religious and congregational leaders, mayors and governors, journalists scattered around the country. The whole idea is to broaden participation in the debate, and we're trying to be a resource for as many Americans and others around the world as we can be.
Okay, so historically, the Council on Foreign Relations was seen as the bastion in New York of the foreign policy white, WASP establishment. Is it still that?
I don't think there really is a foreign policy establishment anymore. With Vietnam, the establishment split. The country's changed demographically in every way. Geographically, the center of gravity has changed. And I think the council has evolved with that. We're probably now at least a third women. We have a significant minority representation. Obviously, we're trying to grow that, again, to reflect what America has become. So, and again, there's a wide representation of views. We don't take institutional positions. We don't take government money. We're fully independent. We're fully nonpartisan. So I think pretty much anything you would find in America, you would find at the Council on Foreign Relations.
Okay, so this is your 15th book, if I got it right. Is that right? 15th book.
Yes,
So normally when people with your kind of background write books, they say this is what the policy should be here, or here is how great I was in this area, and here's what I did. If only the president had listened to me, the country would be better off. Those kind of books. And
I've written those.
You've written those too. But this one is unusual because it says a world, a brief introduction. Well, why do we need an introduction to the world? What were you trying to accomplish with this book?
Well, you've got it exactly right. This is very different for me. And rather than writing what I would call another insider book, which is an argument, which those are important books. I don't want to put it down. I've done it. Others do it. I decided to write something that the British would call a primer, Americans would call a primer, but a foundational book. Here's why the world matters. Here's how the world operates. Here's the basic history you need to know. Here's an introduction to the world's regions. Here's how to understand the basic global challenges of our time. Here's how the world works. And the reason I'm doing it is the world is so important, but the gap between that objective importance and what most people in this country and elsewhere know about the world, that gap is enormous. And you could graduate from virtually any university in this country, including the elite universities. And if you navigate your course requirements the way you want, you can be effectively illiterate about the world when you leave the campus. You can watch the nightly news programs on the networks. Again, you're not going to be any wiser about the world. So I'm struck again by how important the world is. The votes Americans are going to cast this November, we're going to choose an individual who's going to have more power and more influence over the world than anyone else. Yet very few Americans will be thinking about foreign policy or international relations when they vote. And very few Americans are going to have the background to make informed judgments about the policy positions of either Donald Trump or Joe Biden.
Now, the council has spent a fair amount of time recently trying to educate students about foreign policy and national security matters. Is that because you think students aren't really getting the training that they should get or education they should be getting in this area?
The short answer is exactly. Most high schools can offer it. They simply don't have the resources. The teachers don't have the experience. This area has gotten crowded out by STEM and basic skills. And then on college campuses, virtually every 2- and 4-year college or university offers courses in the world, but virtually none requires it. The whole idea of a core curriculum is increasingly a relic. So again, what I wanted to do was provide something that didn't assume background. It's not written necessarily for people who decide to major or focus in this area. But the young man who in some ways kindled my interest in this book was a computer sciences major. And I was struck that he was going to leave Stanford and be unexposed to this world that was going to so fundamentally affect his life. Think about it, David. Anyone in college now, he or she is going to essentially live a life that will track or parallel the 21st century. You've got to know it. And think of where we are. We're living with COVID-19. We went through 9/11. Climate change is a daily reality, a phenomenon. So the world matters. Globalization's a reality. It's not a choice, but how we respond to it, that's the choice. But my interest, again, is to make sure that the nature of that response, if it's a choice, becomes an informed choice.
So your last book was a book that was made into an HBO documentary. That book was about the complications of the world. This book, is that going to be made into a documentary as well?
We're discussing it, so I think there's a good chance it will be. Again, the last book, A World in Disarray, had an argument that the world was beginning to unravel. I never thought I'd be considered an optimist because things have gotten even worse than I anticipated 3.5, 4 years ago. Again, this book, this documentary, assuming it happens, will be in some ways more consistent with being a primer. It'll probably take 3 or 4 or 5 issues and really give people a better understanding of why they matter, what kinds of decisions need to be made, what are the consequences, and so forth.
So let's take, since World War II, foreign policy decisions made by the United States. What would you say are the 2 or 3 best foreign policy decisions made by the United States government in the last 50 or 60 years or so, and maybe the 2 or 3 worst?
I think the best decisions, many of them were made right after World War II. It's interesting, Dean Acheson, Truman's second Secretary of State, immodestly titled his memoir, Present at the Creation, but actually turned out to be pretty fair. You had the Marshall Plan, you had NATO and the alliance system, you had the standing up of all the institutions, the multilateral institutions around the world. You had the doctrine of containment that was really a compass for 4 decades of Cold War. So I think so many of the policies that were developed and then followed after, beginning in the Truman administration, and were largely embraced by all of Truman's successors. I think any one of those could be on the list of really good policies. I'd also, though, point out, I think some of the things done by my former boss, President Bush 41, I thought the way he handled the deft handling of the end of the Cold War, a peaceful end with a unified Germany and NATO, was a rather extraordinary accomplishment. I also thought the way he marshaled the world to resist the Iraqi invasion and conquest of Kuwait was a textbook case of how multilateralism can succeed in a modern world. You asked me the worst policies. What they all have in common is they were wars of choice. They weren't wars that we had to fight, but they were wars that we chose to. Vietnam would clearly be on the list. The 2003 Iraq War would be on the list. And Korea would be on the list, not in the sense of the initial resistance in June 50 to the Korean invasion of the South, but rather the fateful decision by Truman and MacArthur, and it probably was the worst decision of Truman's presidency, to go north of the 38th parallel and try to reunify the entire peninsula by force, something that not only failed, but brought in hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops, and tens of thousands of Americans died in the process.
So if you look back on the people who've been Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or National Security Advisor or otherwise involved in national security policy making over the last 50 or 60 years, who would you say have been the real leaders, the stars, the people you admire the most?
The few I would mention, I've already mentioned Acheson and Marshall, the initial post-war ones. I think they were real giants. I think Henry Kissinger was the great scholar practitioner of the modern era. And I think more recently, you'd have to say Jim Baker was extraordinarily effective given his political skills, his negotiating skills, the tightness of his relationship as well with the president.
And National Security Advisor?
Well, I've got the consensus pick, Brent Scowcroft. I was lucky enough to work with Brent for 4 years. That's a critical job where you've got to balance two very different roles. You've got to be a dispenser of due process, an honest broker, someone to make sure the president's well served, all positions are brought to him. There's disciplined decision-making, disciplined implementation. That's one hat. And then secondly, you've got to be a counselor or an advisor to the president. And often that second hat gets in the way of the first. So some people have been good at one or the other part of the job. Brent, I think, was better than anyone at both dimensions of the job.
So whoever the next president of the United States is, let's suppose that person on January 20th calls you up and says, I'm going to be going to inaugural parties tonight, but I have an hour or so to really get up to speed on some issues. And I'd like your advice, Richard, on how to deal with the biggest challenges I'm going to face in each of these areas. So let's quickly go through these areas. So if the next president said, what is the biggest challenge I'm going to have over the next year or two in Europe? What would you say the biggest challenge is in Europe?
Well, the biggest challenge is to repair America's alliances, its relationships with its NATO partners, because if we do that, David, that gives us a basis for dealing with European security issues like Russia and also with global issues. So I would say the big priority in Europe is to repair the NATO alliance, to rebuild trust, to reestablish consultations between the United States and its most important allies.
Okay, Richard, suppose the president says, well, what's the biggest challenge I'm going to face in the Middle East, which of course includes lots of different areas now, but give one or two challenges you would tell the president he should worry about in the Middle East.
Well, it's an extraordinary range of challenges. I would say the most pressing one is Iran, because Iran is beginning to move out of the confines of the 2015 nuclear agreement. It's not a status quo power. So I would basically say negotiating a follow-on agreement with Iran to extend the limits on its nuclear activities. I would put that at the top of the heap. then I would think about how to push back against certain Iranian efforts around the region. But also you inherit any number of failed states in Syria, in Yemen, and Libya, and that's and potential failed states. So, the Middle East, David, was, is, and will be the least stable, least successful part of the world. So I think what I would talk to the president about, what would it be, what can we usefully do without trying to do too much? We're not going to transform the region. We're not going to bring peace between Israelis and Palestinians anytime soon. We don't want it to take all the oxygen out of the room of American foreign policy, but we also don't want to underreach or do too little. So it's a nuanced conversation, but I would basically say, what is a minimal, smart approach to the Middle East that avoids the two extremes of too much or too little?
All right. If the president said, what's my biggest challenge I'm going to face in Africa, what would you say?
The near-term challenge is one of governance. Too many of the countries of Africa just simply can't run their own countries well. They're corrupt and so forth. I think the longer-term challenge is in part climate change, but even more will be demography. Africa is the one part of the world that's slated to have an enormous population increase, and the challenge will be with that youth bulge. How do you find employment for all those people? How do you take this population increase, which in principle could be an asset, and how do you prevent it from becoming a liability? And that's a long-term program to think about good governance and education, health, to essentially provide a pathway for Africa to employ the literally more than 1 billion additional people we're going to see over the next couple of decades.
Okay. The biggest challenge in Asia, minus China, we'll talk about China separately, but if you include India, Southeast Asia, and Northern Asia, what would you say are the biggest challenge the president has to face?
Apart from China, two things jump out at me. One is North Korea. The new president's going to inherit a North Korea that has a growing nuclear and missile arsenal. What do you do about that? The other is the India-Pakistan relationship. It's, on one hand, how do you build a better relationship with India, which will soon overtake China as the world's most populous country? But also, how do you try to reduce the odds that India and Pakistan go to war? Because when I look around the world, if there were a place where nuclear weapons might be used, I'm afraid I would probably put that at the top of the list, and obviously that needs to be prevented.
And China?
Look, that's the real structural challenge of our time. How do we manage this relationship so we push back where we must, but we don't preclude cooperation where it still serves our interests, say on North Korea or climate change or Afghanistan or improving the machinery of global health? So I would make that probably one of the three great priorities of American foreign policy. Have a real strategic conversation with China to try to establish some rules of the road that both of us could live with. I would put that right up there also with working more closely with our allies, which, by the way, would help us, I think, vis-a-vis China, and trying to narrow the gap between global challenges and international responses.
And in this hemisphere, what about what you call in your book the Americas? Let's deal with South America. What would you say the biggest challenge the next president is going to face in South America, including Mexico, let's say?
I'd say in the short run, David, the biggest problem will probably be related to COVID-19. South America is stunningly unsuccessful dealing it. But once we get past that point, then almost like Africa, the real challenge is governance. I'm not worried that Chile, Argentina, and Brazil are going to go to war. It's not geopolitics, it's politics. How do we deal with corruption? How do we deal with governments that can't provide security to their own people, where you have gangs and drug cartels and so forth? So I think it's a hard challenge for foreign policy. In a funny sort of way, we're better at dealing with the classic challenges of war between states. We have a much tougher problem at trying to promote stability within countries. But that really is the challenge of Mexico, challenge of Brazil, challenge of other countries in the region.
So except for the time when Henry Kissinger was both National Security Advisor and Secretary of State simultaneously, there's always been some dispute between the National Security Council and the State Department. If the president said, how can I resolve that without giving one person both jobs, what would you say is a way we can make our foreign policy decision-making process somewhat smoother than it has been?
Well, again, it worked best under Bush 41. And in some ways, the president made it clear he wouldn't stand for it. presidents get the foreign policy mechanisms and machinery they deserve. Not often, not always the one they need. So I would essentially make it clear that the National Security Council was the venue for decision making, no end runs, no personal fiefdoms, and so forth. And I would basically get the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of Defense and a few others possibly, Secretary of the Treasury, the intelligence chiefs, and get them in the room and say, here's how it's going to be. Everyone's going to have his day in court, but I don't want to have leaks. I don't want to have backfighting. If I sense that you're putting your personal or your agency's interests ahead of mine, ahead of the administration's, you're going to be history. So I think a zero tolerance for the bureaucratic game would be a really important thing to establish from the get-go.
Now, if somebody's watching and they say, well, okay, this is a man who knows foreign policy inside out, but why should I, an average citizen in the United States, care about foreign policy? It's overseas. I'm worried about my job, my family. Why should the average American really care about foreign policy?
That's a great question, because a lot of Americans would echo what you said, but you mentioned two things: their job and their family. Well, look what we've learned. The world can be a tremendous threat to your health or your physical security. We're seeing it with COVID-19. It began in China. It didn't stay there. And by the way, this is not going to be the last infectious pandemic of our lifetimes. We saw it with 9/11. We're seeing it with climate change. So what happens out there doesn't stay there. The world isn't Las Vegas. Nothing stays there. So one thing is, the world, like it or not, is going to matter, and it can pose real threats. So think about jobs. More than 10 million Americans depend on export-related jobs. So again, the world's an important source of our economic strength. So I think that doesn't even get into issues of war and peace, or cyber-related issues and so forth. But I think in very real ways, you can make it clear that the national security of the United States, the strength of our democracy, the strength of our economy, our physical security here at home, is directly affected by what happens in the world. But I think it's something that presidents and secretaries of state have to spend time explaining. I do think we need more in the way of fireside chats from a president to build American understanding about the world. I think, therefore, you'd probably have more support for foreign policy. And I always tell secretaries of state, when they ask me, I say, yes, you spend most of your time dealing with the rest of the world, but spend at least a day a month giving a speech at this or that campus or this or that Rotary Club to explain to Americans why the world matters to us and why what we do in the world or don't do in the world has a tremendous impact on others and then ultimately ourselves. I think it's important because it comes back in some ways to where we began the conversation. Most Americans don't study this. If they did study it, they forgot it. So I don't think any president or secretary of state can take for granted that people understand the connection of the United States to the world in either direction, or why the world matters to us or why we matter to the world. So if you can't take it for granted, you've got to be out there as something of an educator.
So as I mentioned earlier, you've written 15 books, you've served in the government, you're the head of the Council on Foreign Relations. I think you've been the president for 18 years or something like that. Very impressive. But you're also on a morning cable show called Morning Joe. Have you found that more people find out what you think because of that show than because of all the books you've written? And are you more recognized on the streets of New York because of that show than all your books?
There's more than a little truth to what you say. It's a mixed blessing. You go through an entire career. Well, you have a similar thing yourself now. You had an entire career in government, then subsequently in business, and there's probably people who stop you now and recognize your face or your name, not because of any of that, but because of the interviews you do on television. So I think I either benefit or suffer from a little bit of that myself.
Richard, our theme this year at the National Book Festival is American Ingenuity. So as you look at American foreign policy, how would you describe that as being part of American ingenuity over the years?
The way I'd answer that, David, is there's almost nothing about history that's inevitable. Ultimately, history is the result of the clash or intersection of ideas and people. And things have turned out well in American foreign policy when people have come up with big ideas. We talked before about the creativity of a lot of the people around President Truman, who essentially set the foundation stones for an order in the world that has lasted for the best part of three-quarters of a century. Now we need something just as creative. We're 3 decades after the Cold War, and quite honestly, we haven't been up to the test. We have squandered a lot of the inheritance we had. So this is a moment that calls for American ingenuity to design an order, to design a world that takes into account the fact that we not only have to deal with the traditional challenges of foreign policy, great power competition and the like, but also with an emergence of a set of global issues like disease, like climate change, like terrorism, like proliferation, like the misuse of cyberspace. And we simply don't have the machinery in place. We don't have the rules in place to deal with those. So this needs to be the second great creative moment of American foreign policy. And if there ever was a moment for ingenuity, this is it.
So a final question, Richard, to be very serious about it. If somebody's watching, they say, all right, I want to be like Richard Haass. I want to be a foreign policy specialist. This is what I really want to do. What is the appeal of a career in that? And do you ever have any regrets that in your decision as a young man that you decided to go into foreign policy and this is your life? Why should somebody else want to do that? And why have you enjoyed being in foreign policy?
I don't have any regrets at all, David. I feel extraordinarily fortunate. It's really interesting. The issues that you grapple with are about as interesting and also as difficult as they get. If you're lucky and you can have the chance to observe history close up. If you're really lucky, and I have been at times, you can have the chance to help make history, to participate in it. And what an opportunity that is, to be involved in things that truly matter. Stakes are big. You're working with talented people. What you say or write or don't say or don't write can have consequences, and it's bigger than you. What could be ultimately more satisfying, more important than that? So for me, it was always going to be a life in public policy. And when I came of age in the late 60s and 70s, the big issues were foreign policy issues. Perhaps if I'd been 5 or 10 years older, and when the civil rights movement was at its peak, I would have gotten more interested in domestic issues. Perhaps I'd been 5 or 10 years younger, it would have been something else. But when I came of age, I remember not just the Vietnam debate, when I was at graduate school, reading Solzhenitsyn, watching what was going on with the United States and the Soviet Union. That to me was the big stuff of my time of coming of age. So it was pretty clear that this would be the direction I would go in. And I would just say now, what's so interesting is the issues the world is grappling with. It's so much more fundamental than what we dealt with during the Cold War. So much of that was set. You woke up every morning, you kind of knew where the chess pieces were. You were dealing with really abstract issues of arms control. But now these are first order questions, the nature of the U.S.-China relationship, how we're going to deal with climate change or pandemics. Can you persuade Americans that the world matters and we ought to have an active role in it? So this is first order stuff. This is historical stuff. So I actually tell young people now would be, I think, a more interesting time than ever to make the decision to get involved with this, at a minimum as a citizen, but also even more potentially as a career.
So, Richard, I don't know whether I should tell people this, but although I spend some time in the Council on Foreign Relations, obviously, and I think I know something about foreign policy, I read your book and I actually learned a lot, and I don't know whether I'm supposed to brag about that or not brag about it, because I thought I knew a lot, but then I read this book, which is a primer, and I learned a lot. So I don't know whether I was supposed to say I didn't really need to read this, but actually it did help me. And I think for people who don't have much of a foreign policy background, they're going to get a lot out of it. But even if you have a foreign policy background, you're going to learn a lot in this. How long did it take you to write this?
It reminds me of a professor I once had. He gave a brilliant lecture, and I said to him, Professor Frank, how long did it take you to prepare that lecture? And he looked at his watch and he said, about 30 years and 30 minutes. And to some extent, that was my reaction to this, my relationship with this book. The actual writing maybe took me only a year, But in many ways, it forced me to go back and call upon things I had experienced or read or thought about for
Right.
decades. And if it makes you feel any better, David, I learned things writing this book. I've been doing this for 40 years full time. Yet when you're forced to write something that is a primer, that is an introduction, you can't use shorthand, you can't assume things, you can't gloss over things. You've really got to be explicit. And it forced me to a level of detail, but also understanding, to strip away all the things I didn't quite get, particularly say in some of the economic chapters. So I learned a lot as well. So I actually try to write the book in a way that would be good for people who do this full time, but at the same time be helpful for people that this might be the first or only book they'd ever read on the subject.
Thank you very much for educating me about the world in this book, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.